So this is a conversation with writer Saleem Haddad. He is the author of the novel Guapa and the director of the short film Marco, which is now available on YouTube. We spoke about both Guapa and Marco, as well as his contribution to the science fiction anthology Palestine Plus 100. We also spoke about his connection to Fernando Pessoa's The Book of Disquiet while living in Pessoa's city, Lisbon. We spoke about identity and his relationship to languages, the circumstances around his move to Lisbon from London, his struggle with his own queer identity, and our complicated relationship to what we call home. Saleem also asked me about my passion for James Baldwin, which I was happy to answer. Quick disclaimer, our conversation on Marco contains spoilers, so I'd urge you all to first watch it on YouTube. It's around 20 minutes long, and I promise you that you'll enjoy it. Another disclaimer is that the Pessoa essay that Saleem wrote contains mention of suicide, so please take your mindset into consideration when reading it. As usual, you can follow the podcast on Twitter at FireTheseTimes and on Instagram at TheFireTheseTimes. And if you like what I do, please consider supporting this project with only $1 a month on Patreon or on buymeacoffee.com. And you can also do so directly on PayPal if you prefer. Patreon is for monthly, PayPal is for one-offs, and buymeacoffee.com has both options. Thank you for your time.
So I'm Saleem Haddad. I'm a writer. I live in Lisbon at the moment, but I was born in Kuwait in 1983 to a Palestinian Lebanese father and an Iraqi German mother.
One thing that I want us to start with is your short film Marco, because it was recently released on YouTube, and everything we talk about here, I will link it in the show notes and in the blog post on the website as usual. So this is the synopsis. Omar lives a lonely life in London. He's been in the city for over a decade and spends his days working and ignoring his mother's phone calls. One evening, he reaches for his phone and invites over a young man that catches his eye, a Spanish sex worker called Marco. But as their night together progresses, Omar gets much more than he paid for, a story about alienation and the search for intimacy in modern-day London, as well as a meditation on the pain of loss and exile. Marco is also a universal story of that most simple and intangible of desires, the need for human connection and the subtle, radical change it can bring. So I watched the film a couple of times this week. I was really moved by it. I'm gonna ask you if that's okay to talk us through a bit the process that went through your head, essentially, of like, how did you think of Marco? What did it remind you? Are there like real life stories, maybe parallels or emotions? Because it's a poet, Zaina, who I'll have on the show next month as well, described the whole movie as a poem. And so can you speak a bit about the backstory of Marco, if that's okay?
Well, I mean, that's fantastic to hear someone describe it as a poem. I never really thought that I would get into film or I would ever make a film. But I was approached by a producer who had read Guapa and he wanted to collaborate on something, and I said I would consider it. And then a few weeks later, he had been reading one of my essays and he picked up on just one small anecdote in the essay, which was about a Syrian refugee in Beirut who was escorting to make money. And he said this could make a very good short film. And around the same time, I was living in London at the time, and around the same time, I remember I was having dinner with a friend of mine in Whitechapel, and we were coming out of the restaurant, and this homeless man came up and started talking to me, and he was speaking in English, but immediately I knew from his accent that he was most likely from the Middle East. And I had a moment of hesitation where I said, should I ask him if he's from the Middle East and sort of build that bridge or not? And I decided to do it. So I asked him in Arabic, do you speak Arabic? And he was, because I don't look, Middle Eastern, I think he was very surprised. And we started talking for a while, and he told me his story and that he was staying in the mosque in Whitechapel. And his story was pretty much like what ended up being the story of Marco, other than the escorting element. And I didn't know what to do at the time, because I felt this odd connection with him because of the shared language that we had, and I thought, okay, well, I can try and help you in some way, and I went to the ATM machine. I took out, just a small bit of cash, and I gave it to him, and then I could tell that he was almost disappointed, and it was this strange moment where I think he was looking for something different than what I had provided for him, and I think that led to a bit of a not like an existential crisis, but it led me to question what the last 10 years that I had been living in London had turned me into. And I started to think, how much would I be willing to open my life and my door to this stranger? And I think that, combined with the previous one sentence from an earlier essay I had written, came together to make the short film.
You mentioned language. So one of the cues, I mean, the main cue, obviously, the linguistic cue in the movie is when he says Barcelona instead of how people from Barcelona would say it, which is like Barcelona.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where I feel it felt like it's small node. Like for Arabic speakers, it would take them maybe like a second before everyone else to get what's going on here, which is what happened with me. My partner speaks Arabic, but she didn't know about this Barcelona thing. So it just took me a second. It's like a light bulb, like just it was this moment where I realized, oh well, okay, now I get what's going on here. You yourself, like me, and I'll expand on this after, but like you have a complicated relationship with languages.
Yeah.
One, yeah, as I said, like which is fairly familiar to me, and I'm referring here to the a BBC Arabic interview that you gave a few years ago, during which the host essentially asks you, why didn't you write guapa in Arabic? And you answered very honestly, very truthfully, like that it wasn't really a choice. Like you just saw this as because the sort of answers and the way you express is that like the sort of answers that you were looking for growing up, you couldn't find them in Arabic at the time. This, in some ways, I would say that it's changed a bit since then. Like there's definitely way more resources these days, and I feel like people who are going through difficulties or who have any form of identity crisis in our region, hopefully, at least, if that's not too optimistic, that they would have today more resources than what was the case a decade or even 2 decades ago. But I'm curious if we can talk a bit about like the guilt, that this then generates. Consider this as me just projecting, because like I'm not gonna speak on your behalf. This is something that I still feel to certain extents quite frequently. There's always this pressure, obviously, to represent. Like you're representing the Arab world, you're representing in the Middle East, and there's this authenticity question, and then there's survivor's guilt, and then there's so many of these different emotions at the same time. But so my question to you is like, how do you navigate these tensions of representation, in our case, like being Arab, being Arabic speaking, being from the Arab world or Arab majority world, whichever words we want to use?
Well, I mean, I don't know. It's a constant battle, and I think I regularly go back and forth with myself about this. And I mean, first from a personal perspective around what I feel about the fact that I primarily write in English, and that increasingly my world is, surrounded by English and less by Arabic, is, on the one hand, I feel resentful. I feel resentful at the fact that I feel like at the time I had to gravitate towards English to discover myself and explore all these aspects of myself that I couldn't find in, exactly like you're saying, at the time, this highly centralized, let's say, well of resources in Arabic. Now the situation has changed, and that's great. But at the time that I was growing up, the resources that we had access to in Arabic were controlled by the state or by the school system, and they were highly censored. So I feel a lot of resentment because I feel like I was exiled from my own language at a very young age, and I had to find my way in this new foreign language, and actually I have no connection to English. I didn't even visit an English speaking country until I went to university when I was 17 years old. But I also feel guilty and frustrated with myself as well, because I sometimes think perhaps I should stop and actively focus on, rediscovering and getting stronger in Arabic, or being a better writer in Arabic. I have a friend who's a brilliant writer, but for 15 years she refuses to publish her writing because she can only write in English. And she feels a deep shame about the fact that she struggles to write in Arabic, so she's dedicated herself to translation instead. And for me, I don't want that, I mean, writing is hard enough as it is. So I think let me just try and do what I can in the language that I feel I'm now living with. I don't know if any of what I've said resonates with what you're thinking about as well.
No, it is. It does. So okay, I don't think I've mentioned this before, but now's as good a time as any. But I mean, I grew up in Lebanon. I grew up in a household, so I grew up with my mom primarily and with my grandparents. My grandparents only spoke Arabic, but my mom spoke mainly French. And French à la Libanaise, as they say, like mixed with Arabic, and it's just mixed. Everything is just mixed to the point where I don't actually know what my native language is.
Yeah.
But the point in the story here that I think some people will relate to is that there was actually a taboo about everything Arabic in my household. So it's not that we didn't speak Arabic. As I said, we would speak Arabic mixed with French. And I had Arabic books from school, because in school we although it was a private education, so it was mainly in French. And then at AUB it was mainly in English, but during school there was also the Arabic books, like history, civics, and so on, geography, and so on, and obviously Arabic itself. So it's not the presence of Arabic that was taboo, but it was a sort of the way I have since tried to understand it, because it also built into resentment for me. I stopped taking Arabic when I was 16, and I started taking Spanish because my family is also partly Argentinian. And it was this very odd mixture of being in an obviously Arabic majority area, even where I lived, and the country itself, obviously, but having this kind of tension and not really knowing where I fit in this. I can't roll my R's. It's a very Frenchy thing, as they say as my friends anyway say in Lebanon, which makes me stand out, as in the sense of when I speak Arabic, it's very obvious where I come from, in a sense. My background precedes me, in a sense. And this is something that I only later understood after even confronting my mom on this, that for her Arabic, and actually I can quote someone else who said the same thing in a very, very different context. Ghassan Twaini, the famed journalist and publisher and whatever, he was interviewed in one of those short films that I had seen, and he was asked, like, why are we, by the guy who was interviewing him, like, why are we speaking in French? And this, he's the dean of Lebanese journalism. He writes in Arabic and in French, but mainly in Arabic. So why are we speaking in French? And he answers him that, for me, French is the language of escape. Or I think he used something along the lines of, it's what I use to describe things, because it's I forgot the details, but something along those lines. Whereas Arabic is the language of politics, and it's the language of I go to work, I do journalism, I write in Arabic, and I describe what's going on around me. And obviously, in the context of the civil war, what's going on around me is not very pretty. And so this was the context that my mom also grew up in. She was born in 60, so 75, 1990, she was, between 15 and 30, essentially. And for her, Arabic took this dimension of being associated with pain, with suffering, where there are lots of horrors in my family background. So it became this weird thing where I was wrestling with Arabic. On the one hand, whenever I was with other like people who identified as Arabs, so Syrians mainly and Palestinians especially, those were my circles, if you want, and still are. My Arabness kind of just enters more calmly, mainly because they kind of got used to me. Like, there's something odd about this guy. We just got used that he can't roll his R's. There's some French in the background, all of that.
Yeah.
And it became in a way that within these circles it's accepted, but on a representational level that creates a sort of weird well, I guess the only way to describe it is a kind of an identity crisis, because on the one hand you're put in a position as a journalist, as a writer, as all of these positions, whether you want it or not, at some point you're sort of representing a wider world, a wider region. During the protests in Lebanon, when I'm interviewed, I'm asked about the protests, and so there's that responsibility that if I misrepresent something, that might have consequences on the ground in terms of media attention and so on. So, I mean, I'm rambling a bit, but at the heart, the segue between these two really is a between the identity crisis with language and what the dominant emotion that I started feeling when I watched Marco and when I reread Guapa last year is a sense of malaise. Okay, I'll just ask it in this way. Does the sense of malaise resonate?
It does. Yeah, it does. And it's funny because I don't think I had heard anyone describe my work like that. But I think that it does resonate. I mean, I think there is a lot of sadness in the stuff that I write, and that's because I am sad. You know, I'm sad that I'm far from my family. I'm sad that, you know, my friends are flung across the world. I'm sad that I've been living in foreign cities for the last 15 years. You know, I'm sad that I can't live with my lover openly in the region and not feel protected by the state. You know, I'm sad that we're having this conversation in English. So there's lots of sadness, and there's also a lot of tiredness as well. Like, I'm just tired. I'm tired of the conflicts that are going on and the brutality that we've been exposed to and that we continue to be exposed to. And I think maybe that malaise is part of that. And I think, you know, and Omar as a character in Marco, I think really encapsulates that very strongly, where for him every question that Marco asks him becomes so loaded. Like, even when Marco asks him, where in Lebanon are you from? Yeah. For Omar, that triggers this very loaded question, as you know. Yes. It is a very loaded question to ask someone, where in Lebanon you're from. And it's just, I think that's a signifier of some of the heaviness that I think we carry within us, because it wouldn't you know, if you were from the UK and someone asks you, where in the UK are you from, there isn't that heaviness that you get when someone asks you, where in Lebanon are you from? Or even if, in my case, you're originally Palestinian, and then you have that added layer of, you know, really not belonging.
I remember I was asked, where you from? Lebanon. So where you from in Lebanon? I'm from Mount Lebanon. And the person that I was talking to is a Palestinian who grew up in Lebanon, Palestinian refugee in Lebanon. And it took a while for us to kind of get to know one another, for her to trust me. Let's put it that way. Won't get too much into the details, but essentially, you know, someone from Mount Lebanon, I roll my R's, which to some ears can sound Israeli. And, you know, it's a number of very, very weird things where as I said, when I also want to talk about malaise, Samir Osir, the Lebanese / Palestinian / Syrian journalist, whose assassination, 15th year commemoration of his assassination is coming up on the 2nd of June. And here I'll just say that I'm going to interview his friend Ziad Majid, and I'll release that interview on the 2nd of June, hopefully. He popularized the term of the Arab malaise, le malaise arabe. He wrote it in French at the time. Himself, actually, I should say, he wrote in both Arabic and in French as well. So, I mean, I wish I could have the opportunity of talking to him about this. But, you know, as we mentioned, part of the grief and the heaviness of coming from where we are is that sometimes that's not possible. But the idea of there being a malaise, essentially, in the Arab world is common. It's not from nowhere, obviously, that I had this image, if you want, or this feeling anyway, while reading Guapa and when watching Marco. But what I liked about both Guapa and Marco really is that in both cases, especially in Guapa, there is a location, which is Guapa in the novel, where it's sort of a safe space to a certain extent, where people can go there and they can be who they are with all of what that entails, all of the contradictions, all of the heavy burdens, all of the identity crisis, and all of that. And very, very oddly, one of those weird coincidences, just before I was rereading Guapa last year. Just before, a week before that, I was in Lebanon, and there was this Syrian worker at our home who was originally from Sweden. I noticed it from his accent. Then I started speaking to him. At first, he was like initially reluctant to say much, as and I'm guessing, hoping anyway, that most or many of the listeners would know, being Syrian in Lebanon is not the easiest thing to be, to put it very lightly. So he was initially reluctant to say much. So he was just, being very polite, addressing me, with the equivalent of sir, essentially, in English. After a while, I kind of slipped in the fact that I'm very anti-Assad. There was a flag in my house in my room, that I made sure was visible from where he was, so that he kind of felt that there's something going on here that's not just this random other Lebanese, that I need to talk to him as I would other Lebanese, and so on. And that's when he really opened up. And the weird thing about Guapa, it's very different. It's not the same thing, but it also reminded me in the whole Barcelona thing in Marco, is that this was the cue. So in my case, it was either the flag, which was in the room at the time, or the fact that I had to tell him something. This was the cue that, don't worry, here this is different. Like, you're in a space right now that's different. And as soon as I said this, I could feel like his entire body posture kind of relaxing, and he was able to be himself, or at least more so than he would have done otherwise. So the assumption that Omar has in the movie, that he assumed immediately that Marco is either Lebanese or Syrian. For me, and I'll ask you to expand on this a bit, but I was wondering if there was something about a Lebanese and a Syrian, specifically those two nationalities, which maybe in some other context it could be like a Lebanese and a Palestinian as well, I would suppose, in some context.
There was and there wasn't. So there were two. Primarily, it was also, and this is where the practicalities of filming kind of dictate the story. We were also driven by the casting as well. So we wanted to make sure that Omar was played by the most appropriate person, and then we would adapt the nationality to a certain degree to the character. So initially, Omar was written actually as an Egyptian character. And then when Zed auditioned, and he was just the perfect fit for the role, but he's Lebanese, so we just said, well, why don't we make the character Lebanese? And I think that this opened this really interesting dynamic that we hadn't really seen before, that you're talking about between Lebanese and between Lebanon and Syria. There are lots of layers to it that suddenly developed, that we hadn't really foreseen and hadn't written into the script. But then once that happened, and once we cast a Lebanese actor, we were able to make use of that opportunity. So it was serendipitous in a way. It's funny. I was thinking about what you were saying about safe spaces, and I think that, for me, Guapa, the bar Guapa in the novel, is, in some ways it is a safe space, but I think I find safe space a bit vague, right? And I think trying to think about what we mean exactly by a safe space in that context, and I guess it's a space that allows for a certain type of intimacy that in other cases we would have to push aside. And I think that Guapa allows for that space, that type of intimacy, a type of lowering of boundaries, or this vulnerability. And I think, again, in Marco, you find the two characters exploring that and developing that space. as well. That's of this intimacy, and that's done through language. And then the pronunciation of Barcelona, kind of opens this portal, right, for the two of them.
Yes.
That they both go down until, of course, one of them can't anymore, and has to leave that intimacy, that space of intimacy.
Yeah. In some ways, the dynamics of power kind of reassert themselves at some point, and not always, of course, but it's like the potential of what could be possible anyway during those moments of either awkwardness or kind of this linguistic cue of the person suddenly realizing that you come from the same place, so to speak, or any of those things that kind of just break away from the quote-unquote normal way of doing things, I find really interesting. And one of the things that I've seen this said many times about Guapa, especially coming from folks from the region, is that this reminded them of their city. And I think I've heard people compare it to Cairo. I've heard Amman. Definitely heard Beirut. And for me, while reading Guapa, it felt like, this is one of those pubs in Hamra or in Gemmayze, basically.
Yeah.
The physicality of it for me has always been very interesting because I obviously agree with you as well. Like, safe space might be a limited term, especially in this context. I guess one way I could think of places like this is like it might be temporarily safe in the sense, or relatively, maybe that's another way of putting it. It allows a bit more, as you said,
vulnerability.
Yeah, a bit more vulnerability, exactly. And Marco, I don't know I forgot the name of the actor, but the way he portrayed him as vulnerable is very, very raw. It's very it shows that it's almost like the character was waiting for the permission to kind of relax a tiny bit, because like he was obviously stressed out. He's in an extremely vulnerable position in society in London at the time. In the movie. I'll segue here to the Pessoa essay.
Wait, before we go into that, on Marco and the actor is played by a Lebanese guy, actually, and he was very for all of the reasons we outlined, he was very nervous about playing a Syrian character and a Syrian refugee because he didn't really have that life experience and wasn't certain that he could do it, and felt that he was maybe, and I think we were all struggling with that, right? Because there's, the image of the refugee is so huge in Europe especially, and in Lebanon as well, but I mean this was set in Europe. And so we were really, we were trying to be as sensitive as possible and subvert a lot of these power dynamics that we could see being played out in media representations. We didn't want this idea that Marco was going to suffer on behalf of the viewer or on behalf of Omar. And that's why the ending ended in the way that it did, that Marco sort of came out on top of it in a way. Like we wanted that vulnerability and that I guess that vulnerability without actually the suffering, for him to have to sort of carry everyone's suffering on his shoulders.
Yeah. No, that was very, very apparent. Like, it's something that, again, hopefully most people would have watched it by the time they listen to this. It's something that, the actor basically did a good job on this. So good.
That's
on
great.
him for that.
I'll let him know.
Let's segue in this way. I'm very bad at segueing. I'll just tell you from now.
It's fine. Segues can be clunky. That's good. That's part of life now.
Indeed. So this is London, and we mentioned that London. Marco is set in London. When we mentioned that Guapa could be set in a pretty much any of the major cities in the region that like Cairo, Amman, Beirut, and so on. But the Pessoa essay is about a very specific city, and the city that you're in right now, which is Lisbon. I will let you sort of just introduce us a bit to the essay. I reread it just before we had this conversation again, and I've been actually listening to a audio rendition of the Book of Disquiet, which I will also
Okay.
link in the description because it's very well done.
How are you finding that book?
Oof, it's at times whimsical, at times heavy, at times um, I don't know. It's one of in the same way you described it. It's one of those books that it doesn't make sense to sit down and just read it like in
Yeah.
one sitting or even in a few sittings. It's just I don't see the point of it. Basically, the some of the paragraphs, some of the sections are so different from one another that I don't know how to just sit down and read it as though it's linear. I was reading, let's say, I don't know, chapter 12 or 11, or there's one where he mentions his aunt, I think, playing solitaire a lot, and I think that's like 12, chapter 12. It's in the beginning, and it was a mood, like I was listening to this, and probably the way the person who was reading it, the way she was reading it, also probably contributed to that feeling. But like, and probably I should say probably the fact that I was listening to this while sitting on my own in the middle of a forest, that probably also contributed to that sense of solitaire, of obviously of
Yeah.
solitary isolation, or at least being with one's own, let's say, at being alone, I should say. So
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, it was it still is. I haven't finished it yet. It's one of those books that you feel you have, and then you will just revisit,
Exactly. Yeah.
forever,
Hmm.
basically. So can you talk a bit about how you actually came to the book and the relationship between the book and Lisbon, and your relationship with Lisbon, because it's a
Yeah.
series of coincidences on some level, and then it's kind of like things fell into place in a in a certain way.
Yeah. So I mean, I think it started really with the, the need to get out of London, and that was very much linked to the publication of Guapa, actually.
Mm.
And it's funny because this was my first novel, and it should have been this really, as one would imagine, the publication of a first novel would be this like very celebratory occasion, and people around me were celebrating. But I think I had a lot of, I guess, a lot of trauma and a lot of fear and a lot of
Mm.
shame. I'm not. Until Guapa came out, I was not an openly gay person. I worked in aid work, and so I was traveling to locations where my sexuality had to be a secret.
Mm.
Um, and for a long time, I resisted writing queer queer themed novel, but Guapa, couldn't but be a queer novel in the end. And so I was filled with a lot of shame about the fact that the book was coming out. I was filled with a lot of fear, and this growing sense of panic of being in the public eye, of feeling very vulnerable by having written this story that was very close to my, not my experiences, but my emotional experiences. Um, and I think that was only magnified as I was doing promotion for the book, and I was increasingly feeling both weighted down by this idea of representing something or speaking on behalf of a certain group of people,
Mm-hmm.
um, as well as, and this goes back to the idea of language and what language you choose to write in, but I was also existing and speaking and talking about the book within a specific type of context, and this context of, growing right-wing fascism, Islamophobia, the instrumentalization of Arab and Muslim sexuality, um, and those were very heavy things, and a number of things happened in the year that Guapa came out. For example, the Orlando shootings happened, and the way the media ran with that was also very difficult to deal with and respond to and speak on. And then Brexit happened, and the election of Trump happened. That all happened in the year that Guapa came out. So I just felt this need of increasingly that I needed to just get out of this stifled quote-unquote Western discourse. Western is a very broad generalization, but I think it's this dominant discourse that I just wanted to get out of. And the possibility of Lisbon just fell into my lap through friends suggesting the city. And then Pessoa came up from there. And I think, as I was dealing with this anxiety for a long period of time, I tried everything. I tried talk therapy, acupuncture, meditation, self-medication, yoga, ecstasy, dance therapy, reflexology. I went on a 10-day silent meditation retreat. I tried everything. And I think, what really, and Pessoa ended up being one of what I call like the 3 Ps that really helped me kind of come to terms with this anxiety that I had always been suffering with, but that reached a boiling point, in those 2 years. It was Pessoa and psychoanalysis and the idea of playfulness. Those 3 things I think were what really helped me come to terms with the anxiety that I was feeling. And I think Lisbon the city and Pessoa as a poet and as a writer are so intimately connected, and I really only started to understand just the very surface level connections just in my first year of living in the city and reading the Book of Disquiet while I was living here, and so that's what compelled me to write that essay.
So on that essay, as I said, I was rereading it just before we were having the call. The way certain things sort of fell into place, sorry. And so in the sense that just before moving to Lisbon, you and your partner had to make the very difficult decision concerning the dog, which is something I very, very intimately resonate with. I understand this very well. I'm very, very close to my dogs, and part of my isolation actually being not when I say I feel like I miss Lebanon. Sometimes what it actually translates into is I just miss being with my dogs. That, like, honestly, I'm so I'll just say this as a funny parenthesis, but I was asked by a journalist. She did not end up putting this in the piece. Because it's just not important. But she was asked. She asked me in the context of COVID-19, because my grandfather had passed away just as the pandemic was being declared, essentially. So I couldn't go back and that whole thing. So she asked me about it, and I told her, of course, like, it's very difficult. I can't be with my grandmother. I can't be with my family, and so on and so forth. And then she just asked me, do you miss Lebanon? And I tell her, listen, sometimes yes, sometimes no. It's a very, very, very complicated emotion. It depends when you ask me, at which time of the day you're asking me, and what my mood is on the spot, and so on. But it also depends on where in Lebanon are you referring to. If you're referring to the house and the garden and my dogs, then yes, I obviously miss that.
Yeah.
If you're referring to the wider chaos and everything, well, sometimes I have the energy for it, and sometimes I don't have the energy for it, obviously. Sorry.
Yeah, no. I totally get that, and I relate to it as well. I haven't been living in the Middle East for long periods of time. It's been a long time since I've been in the Middle East, for long enough for it to really get under my skin. But I also have that relationship with my parents' dog. Not like I had with my own dog, but there's a likeness to dogs.
There's a likeness to dogs. It's I say that I said this to my therapist recently. It's I can't Skype with them, so it doesn't. I can Skype with my friends. I can Skype with my mom and my grandmother and so on. It's not the same. Obviously, I still prefer to have them in front of me, but at least there is this way of sort of compensating. While with dogs, it doesn't seem to be working anyway.
It doesn't translate over Skype.
No, it doesn't.
the relationship. Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah, and our dog. We had made the decision to move to Lisbon, and it was a week before. I was in Tunis actually when we got the news that he had bone cancer, and it was very advanced. And they said, that the best thing you can do is to just put him to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what the correct word is for that. Is it put him down?
Put him down, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, to put him down, and so we did that. I mean, just a week before we left, and it was just a really intense time, because we had put the dog down. We were packing, 10 years of our life in London, and traveling. We were traveling by boat in the middle of a hurricane, and the night before, so we had, the dog had died, and then I won this literary award, and I had to go and accept the award and and it was the same time that Mashru' Layla, the concert in Egypt, happened. Do you remember that time in October 2000?
Of course.
Yeah, it was when they had the concert in Egypt, and they and then the Sisi regime cracked down on basically activists under the guise of the rainbow flag or whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
So it was that all of that was happening as well, and I was trying to write about it for a newspaper, and so there was just a lot of things happening. And then we arrive in Portugal, and we're driving through, and it was one of the worst forest fires that the country had seen in a long time. So we were just driving through these charred black land and smoke that was billowing up out. It felt like the end of the world, and that was our experience of moving to Lisbon. But thankfully it's touch wood, it's been good since then.
Besides that part, everything was fine.
Yes.
Well, yeah, that's quite intense, honestly. So yeah, I was gonna say something, because I always try as much as I can to insert James Baldwin whenever I can, but your relationship, I guess we can call it, with Pessoa, in some ways obviously reminded me with how Baldwin sort of how I really discovered James Baldwin in the context of that documentary that made the round some years ago. What's it called? I Am Not Your Negro, the documentary by Raoul Peck. And me and my partner, we then took a class in London at the, I will find the name and link it, but it's called the Black Cultural Archive Center or something like that. I will find the name and link it. And it was a course, entire course on James Baldwin. It was called something like The Amazing James Baldwin. Okay. And it was on a weekly basis. We had some readings to do and so on, and then we would go and talk about it and etc. And it just blew his writings blew my mind, really. It was not there. There's nothing before or since that I can really say has impacted me in the same way. Probably also having to do with the fact that you can listen to him talk almost as well as he can write, which is very, very unusual, to say the least.
Yeah,
he's very powerful in the way he talks. He moves a lot. He's charismatic, I guess is the word folks can use to describe him. But for me, Baldwin is also he's attached to a specific location, and not even the location where he is from. So for me, he's attached to London because that's where I discovered him. And then, as by chance, now I live where I currently live. Next to Geneva, is actually not that far away from where he passed away in France, in Saint-Paul-de-Vence. It's 2-3 hours drive or something.
Yeah.
And I'm supposed to now I don't really know honestly what's gonna happen with COVID-19, but I was supposed to attend a workshop, a 3-4 days workshop in his house at the end of June, I think it was. So now I don't really know what's gonna happen. We'll see. But so yeah, the point of this rambling is just to say that it's quite incredible to have an author, usually, or an author's books, I guess, in a certain way, that you can physically take with you. So the Book of Disquiet is this very physical thing that you can take with you from place to place. This is The Fire Next Time is the book that I have with me and I've had with me since London, and it traveled from London to Edinburgh to Beirut to Geneva, and I still read it from time to time.
And can you tell me what it is about The Fire Next Time that really, if you can begin to maybe articulate what it might be?
Yeah, well, obviously the name of the podcast is the Fire. I almost forgot the name of my podcast. the Fire These Times, and It's a reference to that book.
Mm.
It's when he was talking about the fire next time. I think if I remember correctly, it's a metaphor from the Bible. He grew up as a boy preacher, I guess it's called, because his father was a pastor, and so on. So he had a lot of biblical lingo, let's say, biblical lexicon in his novels. And the fire next time is supposed to be in the metaphor that the way he was using it is essentially, let's simplify and say that if we don't figure things out now, then there will be the fire next time. Let's put it that way. And obviously he was especially talking of what we might euphemistically call race relations in America.
Yeah.
He expressed very sincerely, and it's mentioned in that documentary by Raoul Peck, the guilt that he felt because he was living in Paris when some of the civil rights movement stuff were happening. The heaviest part in the beginning, like the March to Selma and all of that. I forgot if he was in it or if it was just before he went back or something. I forgot the timeline. So the fire next time is that if we don't figure out how to solve this question, the race question, let's call it, which for him was not just a matter of racism, and this is what I always found very fascinating about Baldwin, but it's also about identifying where the fear that is behind racism, the way he describes it, obviously, the fear that drives racism, let's say, the hatred of the other, the fear of the other, the fear of the unknown, what Zygmunt Bauman basically described later on as like liquid fear. It's a kind of the fear of that is very diffuse. It's not about any one particular group, and actually the people being scapegoated can change from one day to the other, as we know. It can be black in America. It can be black people one day. It can be Mexicans the others. It can be Arabs the other. It can be trans folks. It can be different groups of people that are already either racialized or scapegoated or whatever. And so that's what the fire next time is about. And the idea of the fire these times is that we are in the fire right now.
Yeah.
And it is being experienced through different temporalities. So it's experienced through different people have different paces, different ways of experience this one thing that we call the fire. As it happens, there's a literal pandemic that has since hit.
Yeah.
But I mean, that is the general idea of the fire next time. So it's something that is kind of like a warning. So if I can use an image, is that you see a tsunami coming, and you can literally see it with your own eyes, and everyone is just playing on the beach. And that's how I would describe it. That's what the fire next time is. In this metaphor, the fire is obviously the tsunami, and I feel like basically the tsunami is let's say at least closer to the shore, and the idea here is that we need to move it. Like we need to accelerate the pace of deconstruction and understanding these tensions and these dynamics of, in the case of this podcast, racism and classism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia and all of these things. So yeah, that was a very long answer, sorry, but that's essentially that's what draws me to Baldwin himself and to that book in particular.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, other than Giovanni's Room, I have not read much Baldwin, and I keep meaning to rectify that, but I haven't.
Honestly, one way to do so is to watch him talk on YouTube. Start with that.
Because he also left, didn't he? Like what I find interesting about him is that he had a very complicated relationship obviously to the U.S. for the obvious reasons, and he left the U.S. for a number of years. But he also had a complicated relationship with the civil rights movement, right? Like he wasn't entirely accepted from what I know, and I always found that really interesting because it just makes him a very complicated character, I guess. Or person.
He talks about in Notes of a Native Son, which is the other book of essays that's excellent. I keep on confusing which one is dedicated to his nephew. I think that's The Fire Next Time that's dedicated to his nephew, who's also called James, I think. But he mentions in the Notes of a Native Son that basically on his 19th birthday, there was the infamous Harlem riot of, I forgot when it was, 1943 or something. So the thing about Baldwin is that he left with a one-way ticket to Paris with barely enough money. I forgot, it's like less than $100, like $20 or $30. And he left because, and this is his own, I'm paraphrasing him, that he knew that nothing worse can happen to him there that couldn't happen to me here, essentially. So in Paris here. And he had a very, as I said, like he died in France at the end of the day, and he spent almost close to several years anyway in Turkey, and this is part of his life that many people don't know, but there's a whole book on it. But yeah, I mean, he left because he couldn't handle it, as simple as that. And then he went back because he felt that he had a debt that he had to pay. And this goes back to the very Christian language that he uses. He had a complicated relationship with religion. He wasn't fully Christian or fully atheist. I don't know actually how he would define himself, but he had this complicated relationship. And but he described it as he was in, I think, Paris, and he was discussing, as they call it then, la question algérienne, like the Algerian question, in the context of the War of Liberation of Algeria, obviously. And that's when he started realizing that part of the reason why he was more comfortable in Paris is that because he was not the N-word in Paris, that was the Algerian. And that kind of gave him a sort of window in his, not window, but like a space. We can go back to safe space, because it's not fully safe, but it just gives you this temporary
reprieve.
Yes, a temporary reprieve, exactly. So he did go back. He was close to both Medgar Evers and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and that's the documentary. The documentary is his relationship to these three men, and he was both. The way I can describe him is that he was kind of if you consider Malcolm X on one side of the spectrum and Martin Luther King on the other, James Baldwin was sort of in between. And he was both comfortable in that position and extremely uncomfortable in that position. The fact that he was openly gay at the time also meant that many people, even within the civil rights movement, were homophobic. We shouldn't be in denial about this. It took a while for that to be, to a certain extent, solved. But yeah, I mean, that is the reason why he left and the reason why he went back. And he always said that he never missed America, but he always missed Harlem, which is how I would also kind of relate to, in a sense, with my own complicated feelings about back home.
Yeah. You know, it's funny, at the moment, I mean, this might change, but the epigraph of the book that I'm working on at the moment is a James Baldwin quote that I came across.
Do you have it on you?
Yeah, it's, I think it goes, people are trapped in history and history is trapped in them.
Yeah.
I really love that quote. And maybe also that speaks a bit to the Malays that you mentioned before.
Very much so, yeah.
The Arab Malays.
Very much so. So Baldwin, and I'll just end on that note, like Baldwin had a way of talking directly. So there is a interview that I mentioned in my conversation with Musa Okwonga a few weeks ago, and I'll people can find the link on the show notes of that episode on the website, where he's in Amsterdam and he is talking to that interviewer, a white Dutch journalist, and he was talking to him like he was talking to the entire Western world. So he talks to a person, especially I would guess when he speaks to white people in his particular context, as though he is talking about the entire Western world. So that's the whole fire next time. It's either you figure things out right now, or we will all pay for it. And he was well known for saying that I'm gonna butcher the quote. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, but along the lines of the future of the he would have used the word Negro in America back then. The future of the black man in America is the future of America. So these are inseparable paths. These are inseparable questions in a sense. And so that's what I meant when I said that when he talks to someone, he was telling the Dutch interviewer, for example, that you are making the exact same mistakes that we made in America, as in like the way they were treating the recent quote unquote migrants from the former colonies, Suriname and other places. And the Dutch interviewer then asked him like, so what would you have us do, or like what is your advice or something? And then he says something along the lines of like, if I were you, I would study us and not repeat our mistakes, or something like that. And he had this way of talking, which again probably goes back to his childhood as a choir boy. There's always talking in metaphors and biblical language in a sense. So yeah,
it is very biblical. His writing is
very biblical. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that ends my lecture on James Baldwin. But yeah, I mean that's why I felt a resonance with your Pessoa essay, because for me it's like at some point maybe in the near future I will basically write a reading James Baldwin in whatever. I'm hoping that when I go to his own house at some point, that will sort of galvanize or at least motivate me to write on that front, on that about that in a sense.
You should. I mean, I found it very. It took a long time, and I think actually I had sent you the essay in an earlier draft that was,
yes.
2 or 3 times as long as what was finally published. But it was just such a. It felt really good to articulate all of these feelings that I had towards a city and towards a book that one would feel but not necessarily take the time to write down and think through. And explore. And then even in the process of writing that essay, I was able to discover more about Pessoa and understand why I felt so strongly about certain elements of his writing. I think it was, even the process of writing that essay helped me understand why I felt so strongly about his work at that particular point in my life.
Yeah, I mean, it is because so I had heard of Baldwin before watching the documentary and taking that class and everything, but I was in a particular mindset when I discovered him, and that is relevant. It's not that the power of word is one thing, and obviously the fact that he writes so well is part of it, obviously, but it's also about like what I was going through at the time when I discovered him. I had just left Lebanon. Initially just temporarily to do my master's, and then at some point it became a big question mark. Like I didn't know if I could go back. If I do go back, will I even find a job, because what I do is badly paid anywhere, let alone in Lebanon. And all of these questions kind of came into place in a sense, and that's in addition to the my connection to Syria, and obviously 2016 was a particularly bad year on that front. But it's in that context that I discovered him, and it's why I ended up building this connection in a sense that in another context I may have enjoyed his writing and felt that powerful and everything, but I have a feeling that it's kind of the combination of all of these factors that is the reason why it stuck in that sense. Before letting you go, if we can talk a bit about Palestine Plus 100. I had actually written a review on it. It was published on Mangal Media. I will again link all of this. But I'll just let you talk a bit about talk to us a bit about your essay, or maybe about the book in general and your essay more specifically, and why you felt the need to participate in this project, and kind of your general reflections, let's say, on this book, on Palestine Plus 100.
Yeah, well, the funny part is that I had already had an idea of something I wanted to explore with regards to Palestine, that I was just chatting to a friend of mine who's also Palestinian Lebanese, and she's an illustrator, and we were talking about the idea of drawing this of working on this comic strip. And it was almost a comedic take on, what if we all the Palestinians, we just all suddenly decided to live in this simulation that was created by the memories of our grandparents, because those of us in the diaspora, we don't have really memories or experiences of Palestine. We sort of just live in the Palestine that our grandmothers and grandfathers talked about. And we were spitballing this idea, and we're just having fun with it. And then I was approached by Comma Press asking if I would be interested in writing something, and I just thought, okay, actually, I have an idea that really fits with this, and that's what sort of started the short story. That was that impulse of what if we created a simulation from this rose-tinted memories, and then what happens with these rose-tinted memories when they start to rot and reality starts to seep in. And I think that that's, I don't know if it's just the Palestinian thing. I don't think it's just the Palestinian thing, because I see it also in the Iraqi side of my family, and I see it in the Lebanese side of my family, that we tend to dwell on these past glories, and we sort of indulge this fetish for nostalgia to the point where it becomes almost a type of dysphoria, where we're nostalgic for something that never really existed, and constantly measuring ourselves against this thing that didn't really exist. And so I was kind of interested in exploring it in that way, and I just found science fiction to be a really liberating way to write about Palestine, which is such a very difficult and dark and traumatizing thing to write about. Science fiction sort of opened up this new way of exploring some of these dark themes, and yeah, it was a great process.
I think he was either the editor or one of the writers of the Iraq Plus 100 book, also by Comma Press, and I think he had said something along the lines of science fiction is difficult to find in the Arab world because the present is overwhelming, or something along those lines. And it's why, I obviously agree with him, and at the same time, I'm happy to see that there are challenges to that, let's call it state of mind, to grotesquely simplify it. But I would be extremely curious, essentially, to see many more of these. So, like Palestine Plus 100, Iraq Plus 100. There's a number, like there's the Book of Gaza, the Book of I think Tehran is one of the other cities. I think Istanbul. So basically, the book of major cities, and I think Cairo is one of them actually. And I would be very curious to see more of those, and to even see if at some point, and kind of this is just like kind of like an open note. You don't have to respond to this if you don't want. But if at some point we can even see the transformation of no, not transformation, but if we can even see like fantasy and high fantasy books being written and set in the region, because in order to do that, so in order for the way I think about it, I'm very like much into the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien world and everything, but for that to happen, really, I may be wrong on this, but I think so. For that to happen, it had to come from a mind that was allowed to think this long and this deeply. I mean, just the sheer time and hour and days required to invent a language and a world and characters and maps and all of these things, and then to link them in books and books. These are things that a college professor at Oxford, which was his case, of course, Tolkien, could do. Not everyone could do it. I'm not diminishing what he actually accomplished, and as I said, I'm a big fan of that world. But it's certainly more difficult for a writer from the Middle East, for example. So I would be very curious if we do get to a point one day where, let's say, I'm not gonna say the Arab Tolkien because I hate when people do that. But like an equivalent world to a Lord of the Rings type world, but obviously very different, kind of set in an imaginary Arab world, in the same way that Middle Earth is sort of set in vaguely in the West. If that could actually happen one day. So like on this note, I will also link the review to Palestine Plus 100, and including links for people who want to get it. It's a fascinating collection of essays. And for those who didn't know, because I actually forgot to mention this, the Plus 100 refers to 100 years since the Nakba, so since 1948. And
that's the brief.
Yeah, that's the general idea of those Plus 100 books. So they're the Iraq Plus 100 is set in 2103, so 100 years after the US-UK invasion of Iraq and so on. So anyway, I'll end it on this note. Is there anything that you wanted to say, or like I talked for too long, or I forgot to ask, or whatever? Just go for it.
No, I think this we covered a lot of things, and it was really interesting to chat and to get thinking about some of these topics. And there are no easy answers to a lot of them, but that's why they're so interesting, right?
Yeah. Thanks a lot for your time, Saleem.
No, thank you. Thanks for having me.